Good morning. I hope you enjoyed last evening. Welcome to the last day of the final day of the conference. And I pass the mic to the moderator of this plenary session, Magdalena Drewniak.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to see so many of you today. The turnout is definitely better than we expected. I would like to also thank our panelists, but for this we will have a bit time later as well, and huge thanks and huge appreciation for the Center of Community Archives in Warsaw, who actually organized the panel. This is a state-funded cultural institution, initially co-led by the Polish Ministry of Culture and the Karta Center Foundation, now only by the former, and the center is focused on supporting and promoting community archives in Poland, and they do a lot of interesting projects. I'm happy to serve as a member of the programming committee of that center, and I encourage you to visit their websites, www.cas.org.pl, and learn more about their engagement in supporting independent grassroots archives in Poland. The website is available in Polish, English, and Ukrainian. So I will shortly present you the agenda. First, I will tell you a bit about community archives to make you more familiar with the concept. Though we all feel that you actually might be very familiar with the concept, you might not necessarily know the terminology. And then I will introduce our wonderful speakers, and then we will go to actual questions for the discussion. So let's start. What are community archives and how can we describe this very interesting social phenomenon? So the terminology might be different. Not necessarily, the term in your language might not necessarily be the direct translation of community archives. For example, in Polish the term is archiwa społeczne, and actually this word społeczne, social, more or less, means that they are run by volunteers, not for profit. They are done outside of the state and for the good of the public. And this is something that very well describes the nature of community or grassroots archives. And so they are created with the energy and initiative that comes from below, from the people, from communities. And there are some collections, so some materials gathered and preserved by these initiatives. Part of that materials are quite frequently oral histories, in fact. And we use the term archives, but in fact these materials collected are in many cases a mix of library materials, archival materials, museum objects. And many community archives use post-custodial strategies, so they collect only copies of materials from private and family archives, leaving the custody of the originals with their original owners, and preserving, describing, and providing access using digital copies of these objects. And community archives might document various topics, and this might be different for different locations, different countries throughout the world. But examples are local archives, documenting the past and contemporary life of particular location, a town, a neighborhood, a village, a region. Archives focusing on a particular group of people, like ethnic group, religious group, minority, LGBTQ community, but also a profession or a group of interest. And archives might also document a social movement, a contemporary or historical one. These are only examples. So what is important is that many community archives tell stories of oppression or stories that have been oppressed or suppressed, actually. So not told properly by the heritage and historical mainstream, or haven't been told before at all. And there are different definitions, and a lot of scholars agree it's difficult to ideally define the term. So it's just a very short simplification of what community archives are or might be. What is important is that we know that there are community archives in numerous countries in the world, on all continents actually, and they differ between countries. For different reasons, these landscapes are rather complicated, complex, so we decided to gather this geographically diverse group of experts here today to have a discussion about the intersections between community archives and oral history. So let me finally introduce our panelists. Tamara Štefanac is a curator and senior archivist at the National University Library in Zagreb, Croatia, and chairperson of Blue Shield, Croatia. She holds masters in art history, comparative literature, and archival studies, as well as PhD in information studies. Her work focuses on the management, description, and accessibility of archival materials in institutional, community, and transnational contexts, with a special emphasis on private, family, and community archives. Tamara has led and contributed to several international projects addressing heritage, migration, community memory. As a Fulbright visiting scholar at University of California, Los Angeles, she directed the study Archival Documentation of Diasporic Croatian Community Experiences. Recently, she also served as project manager of the European Commission-funded project Archives and Traces of Migration. In addition, she participated in the international project Student Lives Revealed through context-based art practices that relied on oral histories in community settings. Her research interests include the societal role of heritage initiatives, information representations, and social life of metadata in international context, and interoperability among archives, libraries, and museums. Mônica Tenaglia is an assistant professor in archival science at Fluminense Federal University, Niterói, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She's an archivist and historian and holds a PhD in archival science. She has taught at the Federal University of Pará in the Amazonian Brazilian area and the University of Brasilia, and worked as an archivist in Brazil and United Kingdom, including at the Brazilian National Truth Commission. Mônica studies the relationship between archives and human rights, especially for investigations into human rights violations, with an emphasis on the period of the Brazilian military dictatorship and the abuses committed by the Brazilian state in contemporary times. She has researched the use of community, personal, and non-governmental organization archives for investigations into human rights violations, including the use of testimonies to enforce the right to truth, memory, and justice for marginalized groups, such as indigenous people in the Amazon area. She's the author of the book, which the title translates to Truth Commissions and Archives of the Brazilian Military Dictatorship, published in 2023. Andrew Flinn is a professor of archival studies and oral history and vice dean for postgraduate research in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, University College London, UK, where he has been teaching archive studies, oral history, and public history since 2002. Prior to UCL, he studied and taught at the University of Manchester and worked as an archivist at the People's History Museum in Manchester and the British Museum. He's a trustee and advisory board member of National Life Stories at the British Library, a member of the Oral History Society Archives Group, and the current chair and long-standing member of the UK and Ireland Community Archives and Heritage Group. Currently, he's one of the co-leaders on the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council's community-led Heritage Research and Skills Hub, Places, Spaces and Belonging, headed by the UK National Archives, and co-investigator on the research project titled Mixed Methods, Digital Oral History, Unfolding Semantic Web Technologies and Historical Interpretative Analysis. His research interests include community-based archives, archival activism and social justice, and oral history, including digital oral history. Claudio Ogass Bilbao is an activist archivist and PhD candidate in archive studies at the University of Liverpool, UK. He admires and supports community archives for their critical, reflective, and creative spirit, as well as their potential to imagine more plural, horizontal, and democratic futures. Claudio served as didactic coordinator of the community archiving workshops in Chile and Latin America, and is a member of Archivistas en Spanglish, a transnational collective of archivists that seeks to amplify and solidify the voices and records of underrepresented groups in Latin America. From 2013 to 22, he coordinated the archive of the University of Chile Student Federation, FECH, where he co-led the Archivo Oral de la Memoria del Movimiento Estudiantil, documenting the memories of FECH's refounding between 1976 and 88, and the university reform process 1966 to 1970. He has designed and facilitated training on oral history interviewing and preservation methods for initiatives across Chile and Latin America, with a particular focus on how archival practices can challenge dominant narratives. Last but definitely not least, Kamil Kmak. Kamil is a social activist, regionalist, author of the Grybów Community Archive saga in southeastern Poland, which aims to collect the dispersed memories of forgotten inhabitants of the region with focus on the Jews exterminated in 1942 and the Lemkos expelled in 1947, and to bring together people of different backgrounds, faiths, languages, and generations. He's a finalist in the outstanding 2022 poll by the Polish radio, and in 2022 winner of the Karta Award for activities promoting historical memory, serving the civic community. He's a founder of the Saga Grybów Association, recognized in 2023 by the Polish Museum of the History of Polish Jews with an award for saving Polish Jewish heritage. Kamil is also a member of the Forum for Dialogue Network. He contributed to the biography of a Jewish boy from Grybów who survived Auschwitz, and co-authored the intercultural project and album Silent Memorial, The Grybów Saga, commemorating the inhabitants of Grybów on murals. His projects involve work with difficult aspects in collective memory and oblivion, connecting community work, art, and history. He graduated from AGH University of Science and Technology in Kraków with a degree in geodesy and cartography, and works as a project manager in an American corporation. So Kamil will bring us the very needed perspective of a Polish community archivist and activist. I, on the other hand, will try to supplement this with my own expertise in a field of studying community archives in Poland and speak more broadly on the landscape of Polish grassroots archives. So let me introduce myself shortly as well. My name is Magdalena Wiśniewska-Drewniak. I work at Nicolaus Copernicus University in Toruń, Poland, at the Department of Archival Studies and Records Management. And for more than 13 years, I have been doing research on Polish community archives. Recently, with colleagues from different countries, including Andrew and Monica, we have been trying to talk and write about community archives more internationally. Also trying to supplement the scholarly narrative on community archives with stories and landscapes that come from non-English speaking countries. I also have done some studies on the role and status of oral histories and archives in Poland, and that was actually the initial topic of my PhD dissertation that after a while transformed into a thesis on Polish community archives based on interviews with community archivists. So without further ado, let me go to the first question for our speakers. So many, if not all, community archives have motivations that go beyond collecting some materials. They collect them in order to accomplish something, to change something, to promote something, to tell some different story, or to tell some stories for the first time even. Fully aware or unconsciously, many of them engage in what we can call civic engagement and social change. So the question is, what did community archives change in the social landscape in your country? And how is oral history significant in that regard? And we could start with Andrew. I can give you mine because I have to.
And now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. I turned it off. So I want to begin by thanking Magna and the Centre for Community Archives for putting this panel together and inviting me here and having the honour to present at this conference. So to address the first question that Magda has asked us, I think she's offered a really useful and helpful definition or description of community archives. And whilst we all work within our own different national perspectives and traditions, I'm not going to differ too much from what she outlined from the perspective of the UK. I think that kind of grassroots activities of documenting, recording and exploring community heritage, often from a social movement or with a social purpose behind it, is a common definition that we would accord to in the UK. But as a term, it's been used and recognisable around in the UK since the late 1990s, early 2000s, but being more publicly and widely used in practice from 2005 onwards. But I think it's really important for me to stress that the practice of independent community archiving, community history making, is significantly older and more well established than the broad adoption of this term. And we can see this both in terms of long-running and resilient local history making activities, where the object is to tell local history locally to and for local people rather than for a wider, more general audience, often from the perspective that their town, their area, their village history has not been told in other more well-known regional or national accounts. But also those community-based history-making activities that are located in a range of political and identity-focused archives and history-making activities. Some tracing their origins back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and others to the 1970s and 80s. Again, the motivation being to collect materials to tell a story of community, of class, identity that's often frequently misrepresented, absent, or falsely portrayed in other more mainstream accounts and institutions. In telling these stories, these archives sought variously to connect people to place and to each other, to build solidarity, to find answers in a useful past, and to support social movements and campaigns to be transformational in society and of people's lives. These are generally movements that actively seek to use the past and history for the purposes of changing the present. So they're not collecting as for others particularly to use, they're collecting to use them themselves. In this way, I think it should be clear that oral history and independent community-based or movement history-making initiatives were closely entwined from the late 1960s and 70s onwards, both sharing objectives and philosophies of recovering and recording otherwise unheard voices and stories with a purpose of transforming and democratizing history, eventually underpinning perhaps the transformation of lives and societies. Of course, the connections between oral history and independent community archives is not just about a shared philosophy, but also about method. Community archiving and history from below relies on a variety of sources, differing from conventional archival sources, which often have little to say about those histories. So they seek to find sources that are collected about communities and from communities, but these are often fragmentary and ephemeral. Interviewing and oral history has always been an obvious way and core method to collect memories and histories otherwise not collectible in the form of documentary evidence. The intimate connection between oral history and history from below, or identity-based history movements, including Black, women's and LGBTQ+ history, as well as labour histories, is obvious and well known. But community-based archives and history work, and local history work, have similarly placed the capture of people's memory and experiences at the heart of their work. So just to conclude with thinking about that long history. So the long history of community oral history, including its support by indirect government funding, has been best told in Alistair Thompson's invaluable 2008 article, Oral History and Community History in Britain. But from the People's History of Hackney, In the 1970s, the establishment of long-standing community archives, such as the Living Archive of Milton Keynes in the 1980s, and Eastside Community Heritage in the 1990s, to the many digital community archives I have worked with over the last 10 years. All have placed oral history at the centre of their work to provide resources that encourage communities to dig where they stand and to recover and promote forgotten and ignored histories that offer ways to understand and articulate community belonging and seek to heal and repair and underpin social change.
Thank you, Andrew. Tamara, could you?
Thank you from my behalf also for putting the community archives into the oral history conference. I'm really enjoying this, so thank you very much. I would just like to briefly address some of the Andrew's points, mostly built on it because just from different contexts, right? So the question is, did they make a significant change in Croatia? I will talk from the standpoint of Croatia. No, because they weren't visible enough during the history as some kind of cultural heritage initiative. We have a well-established heritage sector, right, with museum, archives, and libraries as central heritage institutions. So these kind of initiatives have always been, I wouldn't say left apart, but they were oriented towards themselves, so the same as Andrew said, right? But in Croatia, we have a long tradition of ethnology and folklore groups, and during because of the historical circumstances, right, the folklore was very often the most safe and easy way to express somebody's heritage, right? But then when you have a performance, as a dance, as a song, as like that, you want to have a record of that. So they the ethnological societies and folklore groups, they started to collect material about themselves, not just photos, not just recordings, although, I mean, at the second half of the 20th century, technical equipment was a cost, right? So it's not easy as today when we have digital possibilities, right? So that required amount of money to be put into recording and then to preserve in somebody's house or in the society headquarters, right? So that was I would say, mostly 20th century. But what happened in 1990s and 1995, we had a war in former Yugoslavia, right? And initiatives during the war, even during the war and after the war, about recording what is happening, because people believed that some of the actions and how to say consequences on victims wouldn't be recorded properly, so they started for themselves collecting records as evidence. So it's not archives as a places of remembers, of having sources for our history, but specifically to serve as a purpose in future. So archives, community archives as a places of future. Because war crimes, they don't have a legal limitation, right? So if you collect enough testimonies, if you have enough oral histories, documents, and everything that can be served as evidence, perhaps, just perhaps, the court will allow that as an evidence. That's also a question. Will community records be accepted as evidence, being oral histories or being actual written or records of any kind? So that is my point is that the communities that developed these kind of archives, being the archives of joy, of dance, of identity, right? Or being the archives of evidence, they experienced change for themselves. That didn't reflect necessarily on broader societal landscape, right? I mean, that's it, just briefly.
Wonderful comment, thank you, Tamara. Monica, how did community archives change the social landscape in Brazil?
Can you hear me? Thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. Well, regarding Brazil, I think I go very much with Tamara comments from the Brazilian perspective. So it's important to underscore that in Brazil today, debates concerning community archiving, hanging from their very recognition as archival institutions to the extent to the engagement of formal archival bodies with them, remain highly controversial. It is difficult to establish with precision the number of community archives currently existing in Brazil. Nevertheless, numerous groups and individuals are actively engaged in initiatives that can be described as community archives, producing a wide range of collections that include archival documents, library museum objects, photographs, oral histories, and personal records. Some of those local archives are short-lived, with few records and information about them, with others have become long-standing local institutions with their communities. And while certain community archives assume an explicitly activist role in supporting social movements and marginalized identities, others articulate place, identity, and history with a broader factors, such as the legacy of the Brazilian military dictatorship and the documentation on human rights violations against minority groups. So having said that, it's possible to affirm that community archives have visibly changed the social landscape in Brazil, particularly in the fields of memory, identity, and civic participation. In contrast to the state archives, which largely prioritize official records and consequently reproduce hegemonic discourses, community archives have fostered spaces dedicated to the preservation and dissemination of local and marginalized histories. In doing so, they have afforded visibility to groups historically silenced and underdocumented, including in Brazil, indigenous people, quilombola communities that are the descendants of enslaved populations, workers, residents of peripheral urban areas, which we call favelas, and victims of repressive regimes. Going back to the emergence of community archives in Brazil, the first references are those related to social movements, particularly from the 1950s to the 1970s. At that time, there were groups demanding land rights and land reforms, such as the group called the Pastoral Land Commission, which archives I worked closer once I was teaching in the north of Brazil, in the Amazon area. And also during the 1970s, emerged the groups representing the victims of the military dictatorship and their families, recording their demands for information on political disappearances and the circumstances surrounding human rights violations. So finally, we can mention the groups from peripheries areas which organize themselves to demand rights to housing, health, and employment.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica, so much. Claudio, what about Chile?
Well, it is important to provide context to begin with. Community archives are a relatively new phenomenon in Chile and Latin America, though their roots can be traced back to the 1970s. A recent survey of 37 initiatives in Chile shows that more than 90% were founded after the 2000s. So their motivation varied from a nostalgic drive to a more political awareness to collect, manage, and use their records. Typology, which is an exercise, illustrates the difference between school archives, neighborhood archives, human rights archives, and queer or LGBT archives. Some of them have been networking and work together in resolving common problems. A few studies have been produced to identify and characterize this heritage initiative from the academia, And some activists, archivists have funded workshops to provide resources using popular education methodologies and recognizing their archival practices and exercise as valuable knowledge. In Chile, their impact on the social landscape has been profound. They opened spaces for civic participation, gave visibility to marginalized groups, and challenged the monopoly of the official history, both in archives and both in the National Archives and the academia. Oral history has been central in this process. In the 1980s, during the dictatorship, it emerged not from universities, but from the poblaciones, as a grassroots tool to resist repression and rebuild the social fabric. NGOs encourage communities to tell their own stories through collective cartographies, chronologies, and testimonies using also the popular education methodologies. This practice empowered communities to see themselves not just as victims, but as active historical subjects, and have produced social change by legitimizing popular knowledge, strengthening local identity, and fostering engagement. In short, community archives through oral history have democratized memory in Chile and transformed slightly social relationship by turning remembrance into a collective and political practice.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Kamil, could you tell us something about your own experience of your community archives in this difficult path of changing something in the world?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me and inviting me to this panel. I'm not an academic scholar, but rather activist running a very local archive in southeast of Poland, 2 hours away from Kraków. And I've been doing this for past 15 years. I cannot risk to judge or to say what changed across Poland. I have my own observations as well. So what was important in motivation for me was not only to preserve history of the community and not only carry the memory of the people and events, but I like the part of your question about social change, because from the very beginning it was also part of my motivation to bring more change to the local society and wider society about some portions or some group of society there, the history of whom was neglected, forgotten, some narratives that were suppressed. In Poland, as you may know, Poland became a mono-ethnic, rather mono-religious country in huge majority after Hitler and Stalin, right, in the 40s and 50s. And then after the Second World War, Poland was under this communist government for 40 years. So many of the stories couldn't be told for many decades, and many traumas that people suffered in the war, or before the war, or shortly after the war, weren't worked out and weren't able to be worked out. And there was, this state censorship and so on. So what bothered me on a local level is total oblivion and total neglecting to preserve memory of the local Jewish community in my town, which where 1/3 of the town were Jewish people, and they all were killed in the Shoah in 1942, with very few survivors. So it was important for me to first bring awareness about those people, because the second and third generation of local inhabitants, because those stories were not told. Even in the 90s, they started to be taught at school, but then this was just a country-level perspective, right? There were camps, there was Auschwitz, maybe some other names of the camps are provided in the history books at schools, but there were no materials when I was studying in the 90s in my grammar school, secondary school, high school, about the local local Jewish inhabitants and other minority Ruthenians from our nearby villages, which are also expelled by the Stalinist method in 1947. So no local materials about those local communities. So first, bringing awareness, collecting those materials to bring awareness, then to bring understanding of this history, and third level, that this ultimate goal, I think, of many such local activists is to bring empathy to the descendants of those Jewish and Lemko people who I think still suffer from the lack of understanding and the lack of the recognition of their suffering.
Thank you so much, Kamil. And you also touched this problem. Andrew also mentioned about this, I think Tamara, Claudio too. What is, I believe, in my opinion, a very important impact of community archives in Poland is that, at least when it comes to Poland, community archives show that history doesn't only happen in Warsaw and in Kraków and perhaps in Gdańsk when it comes to solidarity, right? Every small town, every small neighborhood, every tiny village, every minority, every marginalized group, they all have their own stories, and they are important stories. And there are some people who care about these stories. Even if politicians or academics from big cities don't, right? There are some people who care about this, who will try to preserve them, who will try to promote this knowledge. And I believe it is a very powerful statement made by community archives. It's not only about Warsaw, it's not only about politicians and presidents and prominent scientists. It's also about ordinary people and small towns. So let's go to the second question. So heritage and archival landscapes are different in different locations, and to a big extent those landscapes are dependent on local legal regulations, not only, but to some extent. So let me tell you something about Poland, about this local archival landscape. There are altogether 32 state or national historical archives in Poland, 3 central archives in Warsaw, and 29 regional archives. And we're talking about a country of 37 million people. So let's say that the citizen to archives ratio is not particularly satisfactory. And there are no local or municipal historical archives in Poland. And because these state archives are placed in the biggest administrative centers and in bigger cities, many citizens don't have easy access to them, and they have very little connection with these archives. Usually they're outside of public understanding of the cultural heritage even. Local museums and local public libraries are definitely much numerous and closer to people than public archives. And what is very important in the context of community archives in Poland is and how they fill the gap, how we like to call it, is that public archives in Poland haven't been particularly engaged in collecting materials from agents other than governmental and local governmental public institutions. And there has been some interest in private and family archives of the most outstanding, so of the noble families, prominent politicians, artists, professors, military leaders, and so on. And only very recently, within the last several years, that has been changing, and public archives got more interested in personal and family archives. And I believe this growing interest of public archives in these materials comes, at least in part, from the success and growing popularity of and recognizability of the community archives movement. Still, there's a lot to do, and when it comes to everyday stories, family histories, history of emotions, social history, history of food, of children, of animals, and so on, these are not necessarily topics covered by state archives, but they are definitely present in community archives. And it's very true about recording oral histories. So state archives generally don't do this in Poland. With very few exceptions, oral history in Poland is done by scholars, by some museums, and by many community archives. So community archives in Poland definitely changed the archival landscape in that regard. And apart from that, they became another possibility for people who would like to transfer their family or personal materials to some heritage institution. So then there are community archives for those people that are willing to accept these materials, while state national archives might not be so interested in regular people's stories. So the question is, what did community archives change in the archival or heritage landscape in your country, and what role does oral history play in that change? And let's start with Tamara.
You said, Magda, if I'm not mistaken, or no, yesterday Adriana said you have 850 community archives, right? And Poland is almost 40 million people.
Yeah,
okay.
37 million with
Okay.
More than 800 community archives registered in the database run by
and
the Center of Community
32
Archives.
state archives. 32. Okay, so Croatia is population of not even 4 million, so 3.8, something like that, right? And we have 18 state archives, right? So that's a huge difference. I think that we could talk about history of bureaucracy. That's very interesting, right? In Croatia. But so, but they have been established long ago, one by one, and they do collect the same as in Poland, records created by government or by local city, county, whatever, right? They did started to collect private and family archives also of famous persons, right? His historically prominent figures, which then is the trick if you have the change in politics, right? As we had from communism to independent, and also before that. So if you have a change in politics of who is considered to be prominent, and then you already have in archive material of non-popular historical figure, then there's a problem there, but that's a whole different other question. So what I wanted to say, they do cover lots of Croatia territory, yes. I wouldn't say that I could count how many community archives do we have, because they will not identify themselves as, for example, I started to research into this topic 15 years ago. I mean, that's not a long time. In our archival world, that's a blink of an eye, nothing, right? So, and I came into one community archive, which I thought it was, and I said, you're doing such a great and important work as a community archive. And the lady asked me, what is community archive? It's not, they will not identify themselves back then, 15 years ago. They said, but we just collect things to have them to do whatever our purpose is to do. I came to museum setting and here the same thing. So the convergence between community archives, museum, libraries, enormous, and we will not have, at least from Croatian perspective, the clear divide as in official state sponsored or city sponsored funded archives, libraries, and museum. So when you have this entity that is really fluid and depends on volunteer work, right? Most of community archives are based on volunteer work. They will try to find a place for themselves at the heritage scene, of course. They will not be accepted always with the open arms, because sometimes official heritage sector feel like they're taking their job, their professional job that we are trained for years to do. Okay, and then the question is of funding. Who will be able to give funds for such heritage, independent heritage initiatives? Now, Croatia is built on the Roman law, civil law country, and everything is prescribed. We have law on archives, law on museums, laws on everything. And by the law on archives, you can actually establish private archive. You can establish community archive as a private archive, But you have to have professionals with a degree working in it. You have to have stable incomes, right? And you have to have a space which is often exactly things that they don't have and they need money for. So that's a really hard situations for some of these initiatives. I would say they changed a little bit the situation when we entered the EU, and there was quite healthy money and funds for this kind of heritage initiatives of NGOs. So they will apply for funds from EU, they will get funds from EU, but they will not necessarily call themselves funds for community archiving, but for documentation, memory, whatever term they fit. They could use to fit the purpose. So they are on the scene at the moment, and I think it will, because official archives, as much as we have them, right, they're, slow to change. So what I see is, especially from the aspect of oral history, is that a community setting is much more open and willing to learn how to do oral history, to see the value of oral history, to see the possible uses, right? Even just for the project, never mind, but that's a start also, sure. And in recent experience of a project that I was involved with official archives, oral history is still not at all interesting for them. If they will have somebody giving them some kind of tapes, or they will probably take it, of course, you know, why not? But for themselves to go outside, to talk to people, to have interesting in collecting something that is still not the case in majority setting in Croatia.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Monica, about Brazil, tell us something.
I would like to add some numbers here as well. I was thinking that the National Archives in Brazil is in Rio de Janeiro, and we had one regional headquarters in Brasília, that's the capital. One state archive per state, so it's 26 state archives. But 85% of our cities don't have a municipal archive, and we are talking about 5,000 cities in Brazil. So in a country of 200 million people. So obviously in this scenario, community archives can have a big contribution to the national and local archival landscape in Brazil. And in those days, it's hard to find an archivist who hasn't heard on community archives. They may not be able to define them or explain what they are, but they've certainly heard something about community archives. It's clear that over the last decade, some research on community archives has been produced within the scope of archival studies, but certainly in the last 3 to 4 years, this debate has intensified. And I understand that this was primarily a result of the change in the leadership of the National Archives, which is located in Rio de Janeiro, beginning with the Lula administration in 2023. This new leadership of the National Archives brought community archives as its main agenda. At the same time that this agenda was set, the archival community has divided between 2 groups, more or less, or 3. The first one embracing and studying this new object of the study. The second, recognizing the importance of community archives, but believing that they should not be the main agenda of the National Archives, given the lack of public archival and records management policies and all the problems that archives and records have in Brazil. And the third group that not recognize community archives as archives, and therefore they should not be an agenda for the National Archives. Some archival institutions have hosted events to discuss community archives. I highlight the initiatives of Casa de Rui Barbosa, located in Rio de Janeiro, which together with the Fluminense Federal University, where I work, has organized now in its 3rd edition the Archives, Culture and Social Justice meeting, which one of the main topics of discussion is community archives, which Andrew was there last year. In this year's edition, the meeting fostered the creation of the Latin American Network of Researchers in Community Archives, Identity and Social Justice, which was supported by the federal government's Ministry of Human Rights and Citizenship. The network's purpose includes mapping community archives in the country, fostering research on the topic, and developing partnerships with those archives. The National Archives, in turn, hired a consultant in early 2025 to map community archives in Brazil and integrate them into the National Archives policy, which in fact does not exist in Brazil. More recently, in the end of August 2025, the National Archives updated the archives law, which had been created in 1991. And with this new decree, it formally recognized community archives as archives, enabling mechanisms for its recognition as archives of public interest and enabling its acquisition by archival institutions. The decree also added the requirement for the two community archives be represented in the National Archives Council. What is striking about the decree is the separation between public archives, private archives, and community archives. The latter is placed as an exclusive category within archives. So there is this debate of, like Tamara said, if it's private, it's not, it's public and private altogether. So although these discussions are quite controversial, what we can observe is an increase research and discussion about community archives among archivists, archival institutions, and the academia. And although these initiatives by the National Archives may influence debates on this topic, which has been happening quite frequently, they also contribute to the ongoing debating to give it also visibility to the community archives. These initiatives are generating a lot of criticism on community archives, but they also certainly contribute to the fact that finally in Brazil, academia, archivists, and archival institutions are beginning to take an interest in this topic and are seeking ways to contribute and participate in this rich and diverse process of production and use of information.
Thank you very much, Monica. It's very interesting how this landscape is developed and has been developing recently. Thank you so much. Claudio, could you tell us about the archival landscape in Chile?
Traditionally, Chile's archival and heritage institutions have privileged written state-produced records, as we all here have been talking about that. And community archives have disrupted this model by incorporating oral testimonies as primary evidence of lived history. After the dictatorship from the 1990s, when repressive archives were destroyed, hidden, or burned, oral history became a crucial source for human rights archives, such as Villa Grimaldi or Londres 38, London 38, which were important torture centers during the Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile. These human rights organizations introduced new archival practices centered on testimony, denunciation, and symbolic reparation. Today, we are in what we could call a third phase in the history of the oral history in Chile. And oral history is pushing now community archives to diversify their holdings, They are not longer preserving only documents of local organization, but also voices, memories, and perspectives absent from official collection. This has changed the archival landscape in at least two ways. First, it redefined the role of the archivist from neutral custodian to community partner and activist. This is really important because there are some militant archivists who have helped community archives in order to help them how to create interviews, how to preserve this document for other people to use it in the future. And second, it broadened the very definition of heritage, acknowledging that memory is not only written, but also spoken, performed, and lived, and transformative as well. And to sum up, oral history has forced Chile's heritage field to recognize archives as living, contested spaces, and not just repositories of the past.
Thank you, Claudio, so much. Andrew, what about the changes community archives brought to the archival landscape in the United Kingdom?
Okay, yes, thank you for the question. So the archival and heritage landscape in the UK is an incredibly complex but not a very planned one. It's often described as a patchwork, so even if we don't think about the complex patterns of museums and independent museums and libraries, but think about in terms of archives. We have 4 devolved nations with national archives, a range of local archives, plus an enormous range, maybe 2,000 or so of other archives, private, higher educations and other institutions, non-governmental institutions. And into that mix, you now also add community archives, of which there might be, we have 1,000 registered on the Community Archives website. Estimates sometimes have said somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000, but they're often very short-lived, so nobody really knows the full extent. So there's a really complex sort of pattern there of interactions and an ecology there. But I think the most important change, I suppose, would be to think about, well, what's been the impact or what is the growth and recognition of community archives within the country on the archive sector and the heritage sector. Rather than saying, that this is a direct impact of community archives, I think the recognition of community archives and the shift from being something that the heritage sector tended to ignore or disparage or wish to seek to control, to something that's been increasingly one of recognition and support, is part of a broader shift within the heritage professions that goes back 25, 30, maybe even a little bit longer, but particularly in the archive field, about 25 years of seeking to think about and broaden the role and the collections of the sector. And you can see this shift both in the kind of practice and the philosophy of archives and the heritage sector broadly towards community archives in a number of ways, which starts, I suppose, with a kind of recognition that collections that are held in communities and by communities are as important, a kind of an official recognition, are as important as those that are held in the public sector. And then moves from that recognition of significance into thinking less about custody and wishing to take those materials over, but more into a role in which might be to support and aid those communities to hold those collections, and that's an enormous shift, and that comes through in the recognition of funding streams, particularly through the sort of arm's length state funding through a national lottery heritage fund. It's also there's only a very narrow definition of what archives and records are in the UK, as opposed to in many European countries. But what we've had recently in terms of being in line with data privacy, data protection legislation, is the need to define archives in terms of guidance to allow them to be legally enabled to hold personal records in archives. And that guidance has officially now included and deliberately included community archives in that picture, so bringing community archives into that role. And another indication, the most recent, I suppose, is in terms of that the main body for academic research funding, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, has now moved to support, to the tune of only £1 million, but it's quite a symbolic support for community research and community heritage organisations to do that research and support them into that research. So there's been a huge shift, I think, in the community archive, in the recognition of community archive, which represents this shift in the way of thinking about in the profession. And up to a few years ago, I would have said that was a kind of sort of progression that we could see throughout the sector. Obviously now, in the last 3 or 4 years, it's now a much more contested space again. What can be collected, what should be collected, what are national stories. That's more contested than it has been over the last 20 years. But community archives, and as part of that, oral history are a really significant part of that dynamic. And I think you can see, as well as the recognition of community resources, you can see a greater recognition of oral history resources. So archivists in the UK and I guess elsewhere have historically had a somewhat ambivalent sometimes relationship to oral history and whether it was a legitimate record in an archive. And I think that largely has changed in the same way around community records. And so they're much more likely to find archivists being unwilling to accept oral history materials, less on the basis of whether it's legitimate now, more on the basis of whether they feel able to make that material accessible and preserve it in long term. So it becomes a technical reason rather than an ideological reason. So I think that all of that is reflecting sort of shifts in attitudes about what heritage should be doing and how it should be collecting. And community archives are now seen as a part of that rather than something separate.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Kamil, the question is also directed to you, but in a slightly different shape. So what could you tell from your experience with the community archives of Grybów, and how did you manage perhaps to change something in the archival and heritage landscape in your region or in your town?
Thank you for the question. I think I'll dare and risk to also answer the question on the national level and then go to the local level. So I think in Poland, Magdalena, you quoted numbers and you quoted the scientific research, how this community archives impact the general writing history and also state archives. What's the influence? And I can comment that yes, I observe a trend, a pattern of the also the state archives, state museums, schools, education, public education, to focus more on history of individual people, of smaller groups of society, on family history, history of minorities. And I think I realized during this panel now that probably it was the way that Polish state and this academic world focused more on first on as you mentioned, politicians, generals, those nobility, people from the top of society and not at the bottom of society. And I thought it's probably because Poland was wiped up from the map in the 18th century by 3 empires, right? Germany, Austria, and Russia. And Poles needed to fight for their identity and for the very existence of our culture and our, very existence of our nation, our culture, our language, for more than 120 years, right? And only in 1918 we regained independence. So, and then there were 2 world wars, and Poles, and again the communism, when it was very the manifestations of our identity were censored, right? So there was a certain state, let's say, versions of Polish identity and not local. So it's only past 30 years, 35 years of true Polish independence when we can manifest our identity in our own way, how we like to manifest it on local or state level. And yeah, I think that's the reason why the state museums, state archives first needed to care about the national identity, because it's a matter of our existential survival. And we observe it, if I may comment, that in Ukraine, how Ukraine now needs to fight for its independence and shouldn't need to prove that, you know, they have own country, they have own language, they have own identity, which is not Russian. And I think that's why we needed time as Poles to go from this level of this, you know, history at the tops to the history at the bottom. Because first we needed to, as a nation, to make our identity stronger. And you know, with time it came to people to realize that the history of minorities, the history of the local people, regular people, is also important, but this needed to come with time, and it was gradual.
Thank you so much. So actually my last question, because we're running out of time slowly and we want to have a bit of time for questions from the audience. So the third question I will actually ask to Kamil only. Could you please tell us, as a community archivist and as an activist, about your engagement in oral history?
In oral history. So in our community archive, in my hometown, the majority of the material that we collected are photographs or memories or documents. But I also reached out to Holocaust survivors from my hometown and witnesses to the events of when we had a small ghetto in 1941-42. Before those 1,300 people were killed in August 42. So I have recorded witnesses, the Polish local Catholic witnesses to what happened, who were children at the time, and also some survivors. I also assisted American author to write a book about the Holocaust, actually Auschwitz survivor. And recently, and I want to also mention this in this forum, we had the chance, a privilege to find Professor Barbara Einhorn from New Zealand, who is also in this conference, and her family was from my hometown, and I found after some research her as a descendant to the Einhorn family from my town. And 5 years ago, I interviewed a Polish Catholic woman who is now 90. And as a 7-year-old girl, she was a witness to let's say, killing or actually taking how the family Einhorn and related Landau families were taken from the house they lived together by the German Nazis in 1942, and I invited Barbara and Victoria, the witness, to come together, and we recorded again the story, but in a form of a film. So we made a short movie documentary about this story, and on this Monday, 4 days ago actually, we had a premiere in Grybów, in our hometown, with school students from 3 schools and local people. So that's the way that this oral history is then brought to another level. Making this interview 5 years ago now led us to being able to present this film and talk more and maybe have more influence on the young people in this more visual way. yeah, we also painted some murals in Grybów out of our community archive photographs, and we published an album with the stories, also oral history, but in writing in the album together with the mural. So we try in an artistic way and connecting different disciplines, so oral history, art, and old photographs and so on, to connect them to, as I said, first bring awareness, understanding, and empathy for people of different backgrounds, different religions, different nationalities, different social groups. So this is the ultimate goal, is to preserve the memory, but also to make this social change, as you said.
Thank you so much. And when at the beginning I encouraged you to visit the website of the Center of Community Archives, now I encourage you to Google the name of the Saga Grybów Community Archive, look at their website, look at their social media. They are doing amazing job that can be, I think, really motivating for other archivists and activists. So thank you very much, and I managed to spare some time for questions from the audience. So if there are any, please go on. So excuse me, could you raise your hand again? Yes.
Hello, thank you to the panel. I just wanted to ask a question about access in the community archives. With the records, especially oral histories, is there a difference in between the archives you're talking about than those community archives who see their role as making the material available to everyone, and those who see it more as preserving it for a specific community to access and make use of?
Kamil, do you want to talk about your own archive?
So the archive I actually started off on Facebook, because I established a group 15 years ago. I started to collect things and post there, and then people from the community started to add and post and comment, and there was action and interaction. It started growing like a snowball, and only later I established a website out of Facebook and established association, established, let's say, the community archive in a more formal way. So and then I also let's say subscribed or joined this OSA open system for archiving under protection or under administration of Center of Community Archives from Warsaw. And yeah, so the access is online for everyone, but I tend to also care about how this is done, how I present the material. So it's properly first described and so on, and before I put it on the website, right? So access is not limited to the local community, so it's digital archive online.
Yeah, and I think that it might be a good sum up that national archives provide access according to particular legal regulations, while community archives, they don't have to follow these national regulations per se, but what directs them is usually, I would say, care. So whether they care and what's their motivation. If for a lot of archives the motivation is so as many people as we can know about this person or this location or this history, so they want to be as broad as they can, but also they care for these materials personally, usually, so they don't want them to be misused, they don't want their people who cooperated with the donors, they don't want the donors to get hurt in any way because they usually know them personally. It can happen, right? So they are just different rules, let's say, that are not written in any way that direct how community archives provide access to their materials.
Yeah, so there's a great deal of responsibility, of this feeling of responsibility about the materials that families or individual people presented to us.
Claudio, you want to add something?
I would like to talk about access conditions because I think that's a really important topic within the community archival field. I would like to speak about an example when I was heading the Student Federation Archive. Our access of conditions were really restrictive with people who don't believe to the university, to the student movement, and we didn't permit that some far right or right wings access our documents. That was something really strict. Because these archives were created to as a platform to create an intergenerational dialogue. So, and also there is some example as well in Chile, LGBTQI plus archives also don't permit that heterosexual or heteronormative people access the record as well because they want to create their own narrative in their own terms. So I think it's important to recognize the difference between the National Archives access conditions to the community archival field and respect that as well because, as you said, everybody has a narrative to take care and to tell, and it's important to recognize and respect that difference.
Monica, jump in.
I just added something quickly. But on another hand, the experience that I've been seeing now in Brazil is that some community archives are producing materials on, for instance, the human rights violations on the indigenous people in the north of Brazil is the main theme that I'm working now. So, as you said, Andrew, earlier, as you don't recognize community archives as private or public and so on, so they are not under regulation, but they are producing lots of personal information and sensitive information that could be under, if it was in a public institution, the Data Protection Act legislation. So what I see now also, that is important. We need to discuss of the recognition of community archives, because if you don't recognize them, first it's difficult for them to get funding, for instance, but also they don't understand, but also they need to follow those guidelines as well. That is important. So what is the movement there now that we are doing, unless I think, obviously, I think you saw that in Brazil things are very behind the discussion still, but that is the need, because more and more they are producing those information that's personal and sensitive, but there are no guidelines for them, and I think they should be also following those guidelines.
Thank you. Andrew, do you want to add something?
Yeah, because I suppose I can just go in a different direction because of the UK position. So I think it's a very interesting question. So there would be a few archives that seek to, for security reasons and safety of the community, to keep those records to that community. But for the most part, they're aimed at being open to everybody. But lots of archives perhaps wouldn't expect anybody outside that community to be interested. The bigger problem is one of visibility and accessibility, so that they do sometimes create materials, including oral histories, for the purpose of being accessible, but don't necessarily have the mechanism to easily make those materials accessible once they're created. And there's the question of visibility. How does anybody know that those materials exist? So unless they're operating within social media or Facebook, or they're listed on the Community Archive site, actually finding these materials and knowing about their existence is not very different. So accessibility is at least in part a question of visibility as well.
Okay, so one more question.
Okay, thank you. I had almost a similar question. Thank you. I'm Annika Olsson from Malmö University, but I could reframe it. And you are, community archives are usually also, we think about the grassroots archives, right? But there are also elite community archives. Could you say something about that? And we know that they have been very, important when we think about the history. And they are not... Sometimes they are open, but sometimes they are also closed. Could you say something about that?
Thank you. This is very, for me, interesting question, because too often we hear about, and I would correct myself, often we hear about archives of community archives of people who have been left out throughout the history, who have been marginalized. Of course, I mean, this is one of the major reasons why they were started to collect, which is very important in broader history, right? But I had a chance to collaborate with exactly archive like that of people who, from United States actually, who felt that they wanted to show to their own children and grandchildren and their own community their contribution in the broader society, local society of that particular place, right? And they created archive which some scholars didn't acknowledge as community archive, as a grassroots initiative, but it was initiative of specific group in that society who did contribute to the history of that place throughout the 100 years, and they just wanted to show that history. Now, was it represented in a way that everybody would agree? That's a whole different question, but that's also a question of many archives, not just of that. So the access to that, they of course wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged, which in turn did cause some other communities to felt left out, which they were, and in some cases, and now I'm back to Croatia, that even caused the counter-archiving. So I'm showing, right, my history, but the other group, they want to show their own history, their own identity, everything, so they started counter. So this is very interesting from my point of view.
Andrew, could you jump in, because I bet you can tell us something interesting from the British perspective.
Yeah, very, very briefly. I think it's a really good question, and often when we think about what kinds of forms and materials that community archives take, what are they closest to? And rather than thinking about in sort of conventional state archives, or in a sense even local archives, actually they're often closest to what we would usually refer to as private or family archives. So, and so they could be family archives that absolutely, have very similar kinds of materials and purposes, but are often very private. Community organisations archives are very much like local business archives. And so that there are very much parallels between family, private, and small business archives that are often not accessible, not public.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one quick question. Yes, I'm not sure who was first, because there are two. Okay, yeah, please go on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a question on the other end. When you're in a country that is experiencing increasing political repression, and materials about women, people of color, minorities are being removed from state and federal exhibits, and next one can expect they would be removed from archives, it's really important for community archivists to preserve these materials, but at some peril to their lives, really. Not that they may be killed, but they could be jailed for preserving material that's now considered against the state. So do you have any advice for people in countries of increasing repression of how to preserve those materials when you don't have not only no state and federal support, but they're opposed to the preservation of those materials? How can community archivists preserve those in some way.
Is that directed to somebody in particular or to all the speakers? To all the speakers, I bet. Okay. Who would like to start? Tamara, yes.
It's a very hard question, obviously, right? Of course, I know there are international initiatives that can help with such endeavors of which I will not name publicly, but we can speak later, of course. Similar situation, when the war in Ukraine started, I was contacted by several colleagues from Ukraine asking the same question. What can we do now, right? And there is a way to do it, of course. Unfortunately, it's mostly in digital format, right? Because it's the easiest way to preserve, which is, I come from museum world, which is horrible for me to lose the object as original, of course, but better than nothing, right? To have it saved in the digital form. So there are some possibilities like that. But during the course of histories, and Croatia as Poland, I really liked your comment about national identity, because if we do come from that point of view, the country didn't have their own national identity from whatever long of period of time, that it's quite reasonable for national institutions to start to build that identity on the way they see fit. Now, some of the groups will be left out. This is what history shows us. You know, it is not something that we want to do. It was like that. So how can we prevent that for happening? Nowadays, yes, there are models. We can do that. Can we correct past? Hopefully, some of initiatives are trying to do that, put women back in history, put minorities back in history, right? Through community archiving, which is great endeavors. And then we see that people who were involved in difficult times of crisis, of conflict during the Second World War, during our last war, people, even those that were employed in national archives and national institutions, were prosecuted, for sure, you know, for saving what they thought should be the target. It's not unusual that national archives are the targets of war, of course, right? But and they will get support nowadays. What about community archives? What about community archivists, right? I think there is nowadays an international community of people that will support others, you know. That's just my point of view.
Thank you. Anybody else who would like to?
I'd like to put you one perspective from Brazil. What has been happening the last 10, 15 years after the creation of the National Truth Commission is that now we've been seeing a discussion on the human rights violations on minority groups that we didn't actually discuss before. So if we think that our dictatorship finished in 1985, we had the National Truth Commission only established in 2012, so we had a big gap. And by that time, we more discussed the human rights violations on the political side. You know, so people were, you know, they suffered being against the regime, and not only the minorities, you know, people in the peripheries areas and indigenous and so on. And we are discussing this now. And we are talking also about the relationship between private companies. Do you know how much they got from being together with the military dictatorship, and what was the impact of like opening mining companies in the north of Brazil, in the Amazon area, and so on, and in favelas? Do you know what was the impact? And there were people who had nothing to do with political discussions, but they suffered even more, and we don't even have the numbers about them. So this discussion is happening about women, about indigenous, about people from favelas, and so on, different backgrounds. And we don't have those information about them, the state archives. And those movements are making new information about those groups. And I think that has been pushed the National Archives to actually think about what is our community archives. Because we are seeing now many community archives being produced as a result of this movement of trying to find new information about those groups, and because they are part of those groups as well. And I think our role now as archivists, as the academia, and I see myself being a professor, archival assistant professor in the archival field, is also trying to train new archivists to be able to recognize this importance, you know, because when I was trained, sorry, I was trained, like, no, he spoke about community archives by then, but I wouldn't have heard community archives in Brazil if I was trained in Brazil 12 years ago. So I think it is also important to train new archivists about the importance of those archives and be able to support those communities about their use and dissemination and how to preserve those archives as well.
Thank you, Monica. And maybe to sum up quickly, because we all live in democratic countries, they all have got their own problems, but it's not that bad yet, but maybe there will be time, and probably there are countries where the situation is not that good, even if ours is not perfect. So my suggestion would be disperse and diversify. I mean, because we have got some examples from the communist period, from the Carta Center, for example, that was set up in early 1980s. So what they decided to do was not to have all the materials in one place. They were working undercover, but they had them dispersed. So in case of a police raiding their apartments, they wouldn't lose everything overnight. The same would work for digital materials. Have copies that are not only on your computer, that are not only on the cloud, but they are also, for example, stored by your befriended organization in Australia or in the Netherlands or in South Africa or in Cambodia. So in case you will be raided by the police, there will be a copy someplace else outside of your country. Thankfully, we don't have these kinds of problems now, but it is very good, very valid questions. So to sum up, thank you very much for you being here, and thank you, very huge thanks for the experts. So let's give them a round of applause.